Thank you. Before I begin, I'd like to thank my fellow panelists for their enlightening presentations, and to the organizers of this interesting conference. It has been a delight so far. All right, so there are really only two reasons that you might have heard of Nancy Luce. You've spent some time on Martha's Vineyard, or you're a fan of lambasted verse. On the Vineyard, Nancy Luce is something of a cottage industry, enshrined in the pantheon of celebrated island eccentrics. Her West Tisbury gravestone is ringed by admirers' tributes, as you can see right there, plaster and plastic hens and chicks. Off island, however, she is generally and not so gently mocked. Her magnum opus, Poor Little Hearts, written in 1859 to mourn the sickness and death of Ada Queedy and Beauty Lina, two bantam hens, appears in the anthologies In Search of the World's Worst Writers, where she is referred to as the chicken poet of New England, and Very Bad Poetry. In The Best, Worst, and Most Unusual, a compendium of oddities and disasters, she earns a nomination for Worst Poet, female. Nancy Luce's poetry is certainly not good in the way people generally speak of poems being good. It does not have good form. It is repetitive, mostly unmetered, often unbeautiful, and uses almost no figurative language. Yet many people have self-published clumsy pamphlets of undistinguished verse, many, and not been singled out in scornful anthologies. What makes Nancy Luce's poetry an object of comic derision is not her style, but her subject. If any animals can be considered proper subjects for serious poetry, surely hens are not among them. The lowly barnyard hen, in scholar Susan Squire's words, the most liminal of livestock, is far too humble, far too common, far too unsensually female to merit nearly 70 stanzas of inconsolable lamentation. Yet Luce's life, physiological, creative, emotional, and economic, was bound up with the lives of her hens, and to dismiss Ada Queedy and Beauty Lina as inadequate subjects for poetry is to dismiss Luce herself as a legitimate author of her own experience. This essay commits to taking Nancy Luce seriously. In part, this means not dismissing her relationship with her hens as a neurosis or an eccentricity, but returning it to her life's center. In particular here, I will pay attention to the question of livelihood and its relationship to various markers of identity: female, writer, disability, animal. How do these categories offer impediments and possibilities for facing the vexed challenge of survival, of making a living, for an unmarried, chronically ill woman living alone with animals in the middle of an island in the middle of the 19th century? I will begin with a brief account of Nancy Luce's life. Born in Tisbury in 1814, she was the only child of smallholding farmers in what was then the rural center of Martha's Vineyard. At the age of 19, Nancy went into business for herself, profitably trading local woolen goods for a variety of items, including black coffees, vermicelli candles, calico, lace, cloves, and ginger, that arrived in Edgartown, a prosperous port of call for the whaling industry. Making the 20-mile round-trip journey over rudimentary roads could itself be a day's work. But Nancy loved to ride. She was a very good rider, horseback rider, and fast, so that the ground looked all in black and white streaks, as she would write in her poem, No Comfort. She used the proceeds, she used her profits to buy herself beautiful things, a set of watercolors, a yellow bureau. Then in 1840, when she was 26, something happened. The remainder of her life would be constrained by a constellation of symptoms, ranging from dizzying pain to sensitivity to noise to extreme nausea. Most lamentably, she could no longer ride her horse and make a living trading. In various texts, she attributes the onset of her illness to what she calls the first heart-rendering death, the same cryptic expression she will later use to describe the effect of the death of her hen, Ada Queedy, in Poor Little Hearts. It is important to note here that the onset of her sickness is not publicly attributed to any event, nor is its continuation linked to any visibly somatic condition. The cause is clandestine, the injury is internal. Luce numbers among those that disability scholar Susan Wendell terms the invisible disabled, and the reality of her pain was a perpetual point of contention with her neighbors. By 1847, so 7 years later, both Nancy's mother and father had died, her father after descending into senile dementia, and much of the land she inherited was sold off to pay medical bills. At this point, a group of her neighbors petitioned probate court to seize what remained of her property, arguing that through insecurity and imbecility, in their words, Nancy was, quote, liable to become chargeable to the town. That is, likely to sink into extreme poverty and turn to the town for assistance. Nancy's defenders included her doctor, who conveyed her opinions on the matter to the judge. She wishes for me to state to your honor that she does not desire to have a guardian placed over her, that she has never applied to the town for assistance, nor does she intend to do so, and humbly requests that you will allow her the privilege of enjoying her property as she pleases. The court rejected the petition to have Nancy declared incompetent, and she was allowed to keep her land. Nonetheless, for the rest of her life, she recorded and filed official complaints of incidents where locals, mostly young men, would bully and torment her, breaking her fence, banging on her doors late at night, pelting her house with cow manure. So they were not very nice. After her parents' death, Nancy Lee supported herself barely, selling eggs, milk, butter, and cream, the products of her skilled and careful management of her animals, a bevy of laying hens and one cow. But around 1844, she also began producing hand-lettered, hand-bound journals from scrap paper, such as wallpaper samples and advertising circulars. These miscellaneous texts contained accounts of her symptoms and dark homilies about the necessity of kindness to dumb creatures and human too. They denounced the hard-hearted who refused to believe her suffering and who harassed and discredited her, and discussed aspects of husbandry, the benefits of clover as cow fodder, her innovative design for a subterranean cellar for her hens, which she called South America, methods of diagnosing and treating sickness in chickens. And this is actually on the right side. Anyways, her handmade books, all of which include similar content, were clearly intended to be distributed and circulated. I should actually turn it back to the last one, yeah. One features this inscription: for you to keep to remember me by and let folks read it. You don't know what hard work for me to do. You don't know what hard work it was for me to do it. The back cover of another pleads, do be careful of this book. I wrote the last part of it in misery, only a few words at a time. And I should say, having worked in the archive at John Hay Library at Brown University with this material, you can tell the sort of meticulous craft that's gone into the lettering of this text, and it's like that throughout. And then there's other things that she clearly didn't intend to be distributed, notes to herself, her account books, which are almost impossible to decipher. They're just scrawled. So she clearly took a lot of care in putting these books together. Okay. When did it occur? Oops, I missed a paragraph. Her handmade books, all of which include similar content, were clearly intended to be distributed. Oh, did I read that already? Okay. Her writing is meant both as proof of her suffering as well as its product. It would soon become another kind of product. When did it occur to Nancy that her writing had potential economic value? This is difficult to determine precisely, but it appears that it was only after writing Poor Little Hearts, which is her longest poem, and one that she would revise throughout her life. Archival letters indicate that by 1860, Nancy was already negotiating the publication of this poem along with several shorter works. However, the Civil War made printing jobbers scarce, and Poor Little Hearts, a 16-page octavo pamphlet, would not be published until 1867 or 1868. And this is an early handwritten draft of it. These are some more of her journals. And this is the first edition of Poor Little Hearts. To be clear, she was searching for a printer not to simplify the laborious process of hand production, but with the book's commercial sale already in mind. Poor Little Hearts, the poem, is quite unusual and thus tough to summarize, but let me give you a few takes on it. First, it is a poem of domestic partnership, a closely observed account of intimate friendship. Nancy narrates her friends' habits and quirks, their vocal thrill at discovering a fly on the windowsill, how Ada Queedy loved to pose before the mirror, Beauty Lina's call of, "Yessa, yessa, dear friendy." Second, this is a poem of sickness and caregiving. Nancy, as a skilled hen doctor, details her attempts at healing the hens, as well as previous illnesses that she saw them through. She also recounts episodes where her hens nurtured her when she was ill and praises them for loving and pitying her, for believing that she was sick, something that she always denied that her neighbors did. Third, this is a poem of mourning and resurrection. The temporal structure is involute. Ada Queedy and Beauty Lina's deaths are narrated several times over in the poem. They are buried and then resurface as Nancy recalls another detail of their lives together. It is almost as if Nancy cannot stop writing the poem, as though she is trying to extend the poem and thus the lives of her hens as long as possible. Fortuitously, the publication of Poor Little Hearts coincided with the emergence of the island as a summer destination, especially for Methodist and Baptist congregations who would hold camp meetings in Oak Bluffs. Tour wagon drivers who took groups of campers from Oak Bluffs and Edgartown to the scenic cliffs at Gay Head on the other side of the island began making a stop at her house, which lay roughly at the midpoint between the two. So crowds of curiosity seekers stopped to gawk at the strange chicken woman they had heard so much about. Savvy Nancy recognized early on where the profit lay. It was not just her words, but her person, and in particular her domestic ensemble, that attracted interest. And so she commissioned a set of cabinet cards from a local photographer to peddle alongside her poetry. Her account books reveal that visitors who bought a book for a quarter would often spend another quarter on one of the various photographic portraits of Nancy with her hens. Later on, Poor Little Hearts would be expanded into a complete edition of the works of Nancy Luce, and 4 more versions of the text with revisions and extensions would be published. By 1874, Nancy had earned enough money from the sale of her books to purchase engraved marble headstones to mark the graves of Ada Queedy, Beauty Lina, and Tweedle Teedle Beeby Pinky, whose 1871 sickness and death would be the subject of another later poem entitled Poor Little Heart. So I'm not going to go over that. And these are, so she sold portraits of herself, but at the same time, postcards and stereoscopic views of her and her house were also sold in local shops. And you can find these on eBay sometimes, and they're really cool. So Nancy died in 1890 at the age of 75. She had asked a neighbor, quote, "As soon as I die, chop off the head of every one of my hens. They must suffer no sufferings, nor be cruelled in any way, nor mourn for me." As far as we know, this request was not fulfilled, nor was she buried alongside the graves of her 3 hens next to her house, as she desired, but rather in West Tisbury Cemetery, a ways down the road. And this is one of the stereoscopic postcards I told you about. Clearly, Nancy's life story is compelling, but it is not typical. And so I wish to conclude with the following open questions. How can critical discourses such as disability studies, animal studies, and women's studies, discourses that aim to change the subject, enrich our understanding of a singular individual life? And how can the case of the unique specimen, a unique case like Nancy Luce, enhance the sensitivity and acuity of our critical instruments? Nancy Luce was marginalized for a number of reasons. Her gender, her geographic location, her status as an unmarried woman, her poverty, her impaired mobility and chronic pain. But she also supported herself over the course of a relatively long life. She created meaningful work and gained recognition for it, and she cared for those creatures dear to her. So was she needy or independent, barren or productive, isolated or befriended, silenced or vocal? In a partial attempt to resolve these contradictions, I wish to conclude by returning to the question of livelihood, of Nancy's role in the productive economy. Scholars of disability, and especially feminist scholars of disability, have challenged the contention that full adult selfhood is dependent on material self-sufficiency, not only because disability and the related exclusion of the disabled from the workforce is socially produced, but because this model erases the caregiving labor that even so-called healthy bodies rely upon. Nonetheless, to declare oneself an invalid and to insist upon one's own impairment and pain, as Nancy certainly did, is in a certain sense to demand care and to make one's maintenance and survival the responsibility of others. Yet Nancy did not want care or charity so much as compassion and empathy. As I mentioned at the outset of this talk, Nancy's livelihood was bound up with the lives of her animals. Susan Squire reminds us that in the 19th century, chickens were not tallied as part of the formal farm economy. Instead, they were liminal creatures, providing egg money to the farm wife, cheap protein and pocket change. Hens often ran free, surviving by scavenging, table scraps, feed from other animals, bugs. A 1910 husbandry guide, in fact, names them a necessary nuisance, animals which care for themselves more or less. In contrast to the typical neglect afforded these creatures, Nancy intensively cared for her hens, and their care indeed shaped the contours of her adult life. As she wrote, "Many and many has been the time I have milked my cow and took care of my hens, and felt as if I must fall at every step. I was so sick, but I must do it." Nancy and her animals were mutually dependent on one another. To Nancy, hens weren't livestock, but individuals. To give an example, she included a list of her fanciful hens' names in her book and penciled their names on the eggs that she sold, recognizing each egg's author. I will go further than say that they were more than just individuals, they were her friends. And I think it's significant here that although she had dozens of hens, only 2 were memorialized in Poor Little Hearts. Only 3 were given marble tombstones. She had a special relationship with some of them. That's friendship. The relationship was not unidirectional, with human care extending compassionately over abject animal life. As Poor Little Hearts details, the animals also cared for and pitied her. Nancy Luce's animal household then was a form of domestic partnership. Her participation in the economy was shaped by interspecies collaboration, a new kind of kinship, a more profound compassion. Thank you.